I didn't realize I had to do that before it was going through. Or you would have been showing a blank screen? Okay. I think people are going to be trickling in this morning. We're going to wait for a few minutes. All right, we're about 10 after, so I guess we'll go with the trickle effect and let people come in as they go. I know we have a crew working outside, so some of them that would be in here are probably sitting outside working as well. You can come down front a little bit more, Jeff, if you want to, or kind of come over into the middle. But we started off last week, so if you remember, June was faith, July was hope, and August is love. So we were kind of pulling the theological virtues as kind of they've been referenced, or the super virtues, out of 1 Corinthians 13. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. And we talked a little bit about last week about just the dynamics of what that word means, the context, the four different types of love in Greek. We have one, and we use it to kind of mean a whole array of things from, I love jalapenos and just about anything hot to, how you feel about another person, as well. And kind of that whole range, including brotherly love. In the King James Version originally, that word was translated charity. But you have to look at the context, because the way we use that word charity today is very different than what it would have been in the 1600s. And so that's another kind of example of where, words can change, and then depending on the richness of the context we have around, any given word, there's a lot of meanings that can be attached to that. We started talking last week about the fact that when we think about love, sorry my artwork is not outstanding, but it was what I could get done. I think that's actually one of Mark's hats on there, but the really what you're trying to communicate is that when we think about love, it's not a feeling or emotionalism in the way Paul's talking about love in 1 Corinthians 13. We're commanded to love. We're going to hit several of those passages again today. But it's not about commanding somebody to be emotionally in love with someone. You can't really command, sexual love. You can't, it's not about a temporary or kind of that emotional effect. The idea of agape is that it really transcends any kind of temporary emotionalism. It also doesn't just pop out. right? It's the idea, if we go back and we'll hit Second Peter again, that you have to build it. It takes starting, working, building some other characteristics and attributes, the fruit of the Spirit. Love is part of the beginning of demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit and being able to show that, through your life as a Christian. It's intended to be a core attribute of us as a Christian. Practicing and showing love. But again, it doesn't happen like you've studied, you learn, you get baptized, and then all of a sudden, the next day or when you come out, agape is a fundamental characteristic of who you are. It takes work and practice and developing, if you will, those kind of muscles, which is very different. We talked a little bit about last week about the definition of eros, which is sexual love, which in Greek originally, essentially the rough translation was temporary insanity. This is about a deeper, kind of broader love that has to be developed and worked on as you go. And so that's really what, not just what Paul's trying to get to here, but we're going to go back and today even start with the Sermon on the Mount and think about kind of some of the characteristics and what Jesus went through on the Sermon on the Mount. And love is actually kind of the underlying component and the characteristic behind a lot of what he walked through in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And how that kind of shows up. And then there's a couple of interesting, we won't read the whole thing because that's a multiple sermon series right there, but a couple of interesting components in there that we'll go to as well. This is, I don't know if any of you are familiar with James Burton Kaufman, but he's a writer who did an entire commentary series, basically Genesis to Revelation. So there's a kind of separate book on almost everything. But this was kind of his perspective on 1 Corinthians 13 and why it's positioned the way it is, and what Paul was trying to communicate in terms of how he went through this, and why the greatest of these is love, out of faith, hope, and charity. So I thought this was there's some interesting kind of bullets in terms of what he went through on why love is the greatest. It said, love is the fulfillment of the law, which was never true of faith. So faith is like a starting point, and while it continues to build and grow, and we continue to deepen our faith, you go to Romans 13:10 or multiple other passages, and what's the fulfillment of the law? It's actually love. Love outranks faith in the power to motivate men. So think about that one for a minute. Does faith or hope keeps you going? It's about persistence. It's about, belief that God's there for you. It's about, what's in the future. But what really pushes people and motivates people, particularly if they're responding to you, showing them love, it's love. It's the love that's motivating. Love includes obedience, okay, which is, you can have faith, you can have hope. That doesn't necessarily mean go to James and we have faith and works. Contrasted there in terms of how James approaches that. But it's pretty clear from Jesus' teaching directly that love also includes obedience. Obedience to God's commands, obedience to the message and the path that Jesus laid out. So there's an element of kind of being consistent and practicing in accordance with love that is built in there as well. Obviously, love is the heart of the great commandment to love God and then love one's neighbor as yourself. So even kind of when Jesus was asked that question, what's the greatest commandment, and he put those two out there, right? Love was the core of that. Love shall abide eternally, whereas both faith and hope shall not. And he goes on to talk about some kind of context around that. But it's the idea that, faith is what we believe now. If we're in heaven, which Jeff talked about, You don't really need the faith if you're already there, nor do you need hope. It's all about love at that point. That's what continues to carry you forward and sustain you. Love, and this is an interesting one, love, if lacking in the heart, would be a sufficient deficiency to prevent one's salvation, even if he possessed all faith. Any reaction to that one? I can always count on Matthew to say something, except he wasn't listening. Love, has pretty interesting implications. Love, if lacking in the heart, would be a sufficient deficiency to prevent one's salvation, even if he possessed all faith. Why would that be true? Right? Even the demons believe. You could be doing works, but doing them out of a sense of the checklist. You could be, if you're missing love in your heart, we'll go to 1 John and 2 John, reread some passages as well. If you don't have love in your heart, if love is not kind of a core part of your response to accepting Christ, to becoming a Christian, to living life as a Christian, then you actually have never made that commitment. Okay? And it ties into his last bullet. Love works the greatest miracle of transformation in human hearts. Sorry, I did a typo there. Distinguishing it from faith, which exists in some pretty cold fish. So Burton's not given to humor, but he dropped a little one in there. But it's the idea, again, that we don't get there. It's not a single kind of shift. It's something that we build, grow, and develop and deepen over time. And it's part of the whole transformation process as a Christian that we take on when we become a Christian, and then it basically is a journey from there on. Matthew?
And Jesus said the real test of whether or not you have love for him is whether you will obey his commands.
Right.
I mean, that's, so when you say it's a sufficient deficiency to prevent salvation, it's because, at least according to Jesus, you're not obeying, you're not part of it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. If you love him, you will obey his commands, and you will be part of him. We touched on this a little bit last week as well. I wanted to come back to it. There's a lot we could kind of get into. Again, kind of a whole lesson context around some of what's in here, but we touched on it last week. The object of the commandment to love is not generic. It's actually specific, and the way it's written, it's very much targeted. It's not you kind of generally love things, or even you love humanity. It's about loving the individual, loving the person that you're interacting with, loving the person that you are interacting with and not well. And it's that issue of getting past that to come back and say, despite everything, how do you hang on to that attitude of, I may be angry with somebody, there may be people at church I don't like. That doesn't mean that I'm not doing and working towards, what's best for them and what's good for them, and that's how I respond. It's not humanism. And that has an interesting kind of connection to that second bullet. Humanism is by definition, and I'm thinking of the formal sense of humanism, it's all about humanity, betterment of humanity, etc., which at its core is atheist and doesn't believe in God. Humanitarianism, which we think about kind of, again, that sort of generic, broader sense of doing things that are good for humanity, that's good. But this sense of love in 1 Corinthians and agape is all about how you are basically treating and dealing with the person sitting next to you. It's all about the other people that are here on Sunday morning or that are part of this family, whether they're here or not here, or your neighbors or the people you work with, and how you basically deal with and treat other people. The men's class is going through attributes of God right now. And one of the things, of course, that frequently comes out, and you'll see I'm communicating more in a couple of things on there in terms of today we tend to do, well, want to do God is love and put a big period there and just, we're done. God is love, that's it. God would never do, and we struggle with the Old Testament and the New Testament versions of God, and a lot of people want to basically say, yeah, well, I don't like the Old Testament God, and so I'm going to ignore that. And the reality is God is unchanging. The Old Testament and the New Testament God are the same. And while we're not going to do the whole run through of the attributes of God, which you can join the men's class if you want to do that, you know, whether you talk about God is love, but God is also justice, forgiveness, grace, humor, anger. Okay, a lot of things that we think of as, you know, human emotions came from God. And God has those characteristics. He is long-suffering. And God's love, and this is where sometimes we can get into this kind of trap of God is love, and our sense of love is pretty soft. Everybody's okay. God does not enable. God holds people accountable. God's love holds people accountable. Matthew's point about love including obedience. Okay, Jesus held people accountable. We're gonna come back to that a little bit as well. We like things that are kind of simple and clean. We don't want a lot of gray around it. We don't like things that are too nuanced. But the whole notion of love has tremendous depth, and it's part of this whole kind of journey of growing to be more Christ-like and more like God. Imago Dei. We have Christ within us, and so it's about letting that image come through and growing more and more to be able to reflect Christ's love as we go forward. So if you say love is God, which that's kind of the flip of when you say God is love, that really you don't really have to worry about God if you just kind of recognize love. It's almost the equivalent of saying, well, we worship love, which is kind of this generic sense of humanity and, you know, doing humanitarian things, etc. That's not really what God's called us to. Okay, nor is that really the characteristic of God when John says God is love. God's is a very tough love. It's not a soft love. We would characterize it as tender but firm. And so when we get into kind of, you know, looking at what that means, there are different nuances to that. We're gonna jump into Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. And if you start reading that, you know, and you kind of go through it and you read it from the context of where it ends and what Jesus has to say about kind of love, this kind of deeper characteristic of what that phrase means, God is love, is what flows through there. That everything builds on that idea of we're commanded to love, and love is what lasts. But it's that agape sense of this has to characterize everything we do. It becomes the dominant picture that anybody sees when they look at us. It's interesting. I've done faith, hope, and love before, but the last couple of years, you know, and things we've experienced, did change some things when I went back and kind of started through this and said, you know, think about the last couple of years and how we've seen people respond to some of the challenges. Or thinking about it's all about me or my rights, or it's all about actually trying to take care of each other and help each other, or the fear drove a lot of things out. And we had people responding with a level of fear that prevented them from actually, you know, reflecting who we're supposed to be. So it's been an interesting, challenging, you know, over the last year and a half, if you could step back and think about it and think about this kind of characteristic and the agape context of love, and then basically say, how did we really play that out over the last year and a half? You know, what really drove us when we thought about things? So let's go to the last bullet on there. That commandment is also, as Jesus was regularly, very idealistic. But at the same time, it was intended to be something that we work towards. It was realizable. It was something that you can't say, well, I can never get there, so why try? The idea of teleos, or perfection, the end, which we're going to see in Matthew 5, verses 43, it's literally, that's what we're striving to. That's what we're trying to work to. We're trying to work to that sense of agape love is perfection. It is reaching that kind of end state where we truly can love like Christ loved us, like God loves us. But that again means, for us, that's a lifelong journey of continuing to work on that and push towards that. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit of Matthew 5. If you got your Bible, it might be easier to kind of pull that out. And when he saw the multitudes, he went up on the mountain, and after he had sat down, his disciples came to him, and opening his mouth, he began to teach them. Now think about it as we go through these, and think about these maybe in a little bit different way than you have, and think about them relative to how would they fit with this notion of agape love? Okay? How do they become, in fact, kind of part of the characteristics of love? We were on that last slide. One of the bullets was, love is not kindness, but kindness is a part of love. So if all you are is kind, that's still well short of agape love. I can be kind, still hate you, but force myself to be kind to you. That's a start, right? That goes back to 2 Peter. But it's not the essence of kind of what we're moving to. So think about the Beatitudes as we go through them. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then in verse 11, this is going to lead into a whole set of things that Paul deals with later. Jesus comes back to as well. He hits this point multiple times in his teachings. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you. Why? Because of me. So in other words, if we are actually, and I would take this even back to the obedience point, if we are acting Christ out in our lives, if we were reflecting that, if we were reflecting his truth and his teachings, if you will, then that is not a popularity contest. We're not going to always be popular. We will be persecuted because of that. And we have, I think, lost our sense of that as well. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. From the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you, same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. In 19, it's interesting because this, goes to the obedience question, that anyone who sets aside one of the commands, or anyone who teaches these commands will be called great. So if you set them aside, it would be called least. And he hits, again, right at the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. So he's not, the whole way he started through the Beatitudes is not legalism. It's not, kind of the way the Pharisees approach things. It's literally going to come down to, as he continues, what's in your heart? Have you kind of embedded, and is that love reflecting in everything that you do? If you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and reconcile with them. and then come and offer your gift. Okay? What's that a response to? It's about loving that person and going and basically reconciling with them, dealing with that relationship very directly before you worry about other things. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies. Okay, are we going to have an emotional response to loving our enemies? This is, again, back to this notion of this is about agape. Maybe I can get away with it as philios, brotherly love, but it's about literally continuing to kind of maintain, even if I disagree with you, even if I disagree with outside of the church, inside the church, your position on something, how I treat you should be above that. So I should treat you with love regardless. Even if I'm, questioning kind of what you're doing, and we know we struggle with that all the time, right? We're going to hit the issue of judgment. That you may be children of your Father in heaven. Then skip down. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? And yet, we're going to see later, we are called to do that. So that's going to be an interesting kind of contrast as well. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So he kind of ends up chapter 5 on that note after having gone through this kind of set of the Beatitudes, obedience, commandments, not worrying about whether we're persecuted because we're actually doing what God has called us to do. And the idea of being perfect there, that word is teleos. Perfection, the end. You're trying to get to the point where basically you respond and you deal with things in love as God would. And that's what we're building on, and that's the path that we're trying to follow. Now, if you jump ahead to chapter 7 and the idea of that path, again, when we stop with maybe just a sense of a God is love as a soft love, when we hit other parts of the Sermon on the Mount, it's a little bit tougher messaging. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. From the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure used, it will be measured to you. 6 is a fairly, we don't always like to talk about that one, but do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under your feet and turn and tear you to pieces. So we have some kind of challenging teachings in here. But then we get to 13, which again counters some of the context that sometimes people use when they just say God is love and they stop there. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. And then towards the end of 7, it's not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who's in heaven. And the first point of doing the will of my Father who's in heaven is love your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Go back to kind of where he goes as well. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. So there is love, and love is expected, but it has all these other nuances and context around it, and it has a depth to it that basically isn't about challenging everybody else, it's about challenging ourselves. How do we continue to grow in that path, to continue to develop? Go back to 2 Peter. What's the very last thing that you add to your growth as a Christian, right? We got kindness in here. We've got brotherly kindness. We've got gentleness. But at the end, okay, perfection, teleos, is actually love. Above all that, what you're working towards is that ability for us to actually love each other. And that in itself has some interesting kind of implications. So if we transition back, Mark 12, the most important commandment was, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord with all your God, with all your heart, and with all your soul, and all your mind, and with all your strength." And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. And there's no commandment greater than these. So when we go back to obedience, again, we're starting right against, those two as what we're commanded to do. But then there's a lot of context around that. So this is going to be a series of scriptures that we're familiar with. We're not going to go through them all. When you think about that kind of the characterization of love and those two commandments and where we go first, what's the first commandment? Right? Love God, because everything comes from that. He loved us. Jesus loved us enough that they both kind of made that sacrifice. And so that's the commandment, because everything comes from that. If you actually grow and develop and begin to develop a love that reflects God, and that's what's coming out, then the second commandment kind of follows from that. But we actually have a nuance that I think they're related for a different reason. But if you go through, there are 50, 60 passages that basically talk about love one another, or the one another passages. Do things, encourage, build up. All of those one another passages, what are they talking about? Right? They're talking about actually how we reflect love to each other within the body. So the one another passages are actually talking about if we can't practice that level of love inside of the church, then how in the world do we do that anywhere else? And I think when you step back, and if you went back and started to read and go back and reread some of the one another passages, even the ones that have a negative spin to them, and where they basically say don't trash each other, etc. They all come from that context of, if you can't even do that, then how do you really adequately reflect love to those outside of the body? So, that's one of the challenges I think when we go through this, is you have to start there. So our reaching in, reaching up, reaching out, reaching in, going back, or reaching in, going, whichever way it went, is the idea that you have to kind of connect with each other first. You have to connect with God, then you have to connect with each other, and you use that to drive the connection to others and how we reach out and how we continue. Because if we have that love here, then that again is strengthening us and encouraging us to love others that are around us. So John 14, 34 and 35, again, a new command I give you. So this is coming from Jesus. Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. So is that a generic kind of love your neighbor? I mean, what he was talking to right there was his disciples. He was basically saying, because they'd had their own struggles, right? And challenges at times. And we continued to see that in first century church, etc. Part of where you start is loving one another inside the church, because if everyone else sees that, right, then that reflection is they will know you're my disciples, because of the nature and the quality of that love and the love we show for each other. The church is just the called out people. I mean, it basically is not a building. It is the community that's there. Yeah. So I'm using it in that way. It's the family that meets here at Naperville, but also, Christians that we deal with and work with every day. In 1 John 4, dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love one another, or does not love, does not know God, because God is love. Passage we go to regularly. And this is, in John, he's using a broader context for his message about love one another. This is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. We love because he loved us first. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love his brother and sister. So you can kind of, with 1 John 4, go back and forth between this kind of notion of loving each other within the Christian community, but also, loving kind of beyond that. And that's kind of the broader notion of love that we get out of John when we read it. In Romans 13, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. So interesting context there, right? That is actually a debt. Who do we owe that debt to? I think we owe that debt to God. That is a part of the commandment and part of the response, that we are called to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. All the way back to where we started about, that being the fulfillment of the law. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other commands there may be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. So again, we've got this kind of layered sense of, we had the first commandment, which was love God. Then that drives a response from us, which is to reflect that love to others. Loving one another within the body is the start of that. Because again, I think the notion we get, if you go read kind of the whole set of one another passages, is if we can't treat each other well, we can't love each other, regardless of whether we disagree on some points or not, then what does that mean for our ability to actually then act out that love with others? And so that's where I think we're called to. And so, okay. Hey, David, can you see? Clicker has. Hey, David. Last slide. Well, it won't. My clicker's gone, I think. Oh, yep. It'll turn it off, but it wouldn't move. There it is. Okay. So this goes back to 2 Peter 1, where I wanted to kind of end up. And next week we're going to really try to come to some kind of practical implications and kind of base it off of 2 Peter, as well as some of the characterizations of love back up in 1 Corinthians 13. But it's this notion of, again, building, and how do we not just kind of read that we're supposed to love and just say, okay, well, I need to start loving. But in fact, there's a progression to get there. Add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, to knowledge self-control. So it's certainly having the context and learning what we should be doing, but then actually having the self-control and the discipline and the level of obedience to actually begin to do it. And to that we add perseverance, which is continuing to push forward regardless, which is where kind of faith and hope come in as well. Brotherly kindness, which we build as we go, and then to that, finally, love. So think about that a little bit. Go back, maybe read some of the one another passages and kind of put those in context, and we will pick up there next week. Hopefully, I will actually have my voice back by then.